Welcome to Bag End, the front hall, to be specific. It's got to be one of the most recognizable and beloved film sets ever built. It passes that all-important bar in filmmaking. It somehow feels real. Now here's what's really interesting about this set. It was based on this specific artwork created by the artist John Howe long before the making of the films. And going even farther back in time, you'll find this charming little sketch drawn by the hand of Tolkien himself. Today, any one of us can conjure the image of Bag End inside our mind, but that's owing to decades of collaborative imagination of the world of Middle Earth. So in this video, I want to look at how many artists over many years have visually interpreted Tolkien's writing, and how they influenced the most popular depiction of Middle Earth, Jackson's live-action Lord of the Rings film trilogy. As we'll see, distinguishing what is influential from what is not might be more difficult than you think. If you've ever felt like the cinematography in The Lord of the Rings reminds you of paintings, that is not a coincidence. A lot of images from the films are directly influenced by hand-drawn illustrations. Sometimes you can't even call it influence, the illustration is just in the film. My favorite example of this is the Tower of Orthanc, imagined here by artist Alan Lee and published in 1991, 6 years before production of the films began. Now, it's practically identical to the Orthanc that appears in the films. Now, there's another design of Orthanc that was not used in the films, and interestingly, this one was illustrated by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, why Jackson chose not to refer to the original author in this case is a fascinating creative question, and to understand it, we really need to go back to the beginning. It's pretty surprising how many well-known illustrations of Middle-earth were actually created by Tolkien himself. And you might recognize some of these from book covers you've seen over the years. Here's how he imagined Hobbiton. There's also Rivendell, Fangorn Forest, Mount Doom. Lots of familiar places in the story were first given visual character by Tolkien. He even designed the Doors of Durin, which also made it directly into Jackson's films. Not to mention the famous calligraphy of the inscription on the ring. So the point here is that Tolkien cared about how Middle-earth looked in the mind's eye. He had a clear aesthetic point of view. And of course, one of the things that makes Tolkien so interesting is that his artwork, which might have been merely supplemental to another author, was integral to his writing process. To him, there was no distinction between the stories he was writing, the languages he was creating, and the landscapes he was drawing. He famously drew maps first and then invented stories to fit them, which might seem counterintuitive. And together they constituted a single coherent, imagined reality, and that is in large part why Tolkien is so enjoyable to read. So all of that means that anyone who took up the mantle of imagining Middle-earth had a huge responsibility to honor the very particular ideas and sensibilities expressed in both his written and illustrated works. Now, there weren't many other illustrators whose work Tolkien saw, and even fewer that he approved of, but there was one, Pauline Baines, whose work does bear some similarity to Tolkien's own work. She was known for her illustrations of C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia and other children's stories. I have one of her book covers here, and as you can see, it's a more whimsical interpretation of Tolkien. It features the character Tom Bombadil, who is one of Tolkien's earliest inventions. She's also credited with this illustrated map of Middle-earth based on Tolkien's original sketches and Christopher Tolkien's later drawings. It's the origin of this famous image of the entire fellowship, including Bill the pony. I also love this little Oliphant chilling down here. Her work is often described as storybook or folkloric, more the stuff of children's fairy tales than of epic fantasy. And I think this highlights an interesting tension at the heart of imagining Middle-earth. Sometimes it feels natural to imagine it as quaint and charming, and other times as mythic and somber. Now, it doesn't have to be one or the other, and in fact, the dialectic might be the reason it works. Now, let us not forget that Middle-earth has also been imagined as psychedelic, because one of the quirks of Tolkien's cultural impact is that The Lord of the Rings achieved success in the context of the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s. One illustrator whose work Tolkien did most assuredly not approve of was Barbara Remington. She was commissioned to illustrate book covers for the U.S. paperback editions of The Lord of the Rings in 1965, and the triptych she created, along with her own interpretation of the map, was hung on dorm room walls across the country. Now, she was given very little time to create the images and therefore did not read the books, which might explain the presence of emus. Though in her defense, Tolkien never says there aren't emus in Middle Earth. Maybe they're the nameless things that dwell in the deepest tunnels of Moria. In any case, when he saw the illustrations, Tolkien called them ugly and asked, "Where is this place?" So suffice to say, this was not consistent with his own vision for Middle Earth. And that makes it all the more ironic that this edition was by far the most commercially successful in the US at that time, meaning that Remington's artwork was, for most people, their first introduction to the visual aesthetic of Middle Earth. Now, the brothers Hildebrandt, Tim and Greg, were the most prolific Tolkien illustrators of the 1970s, and their style is probably what most people imagine when they hear the word fantasy. The Hildebrandts were commercial illustrators rather than Tolkien fans per se, so the images are bold and colorful. They're deeply imaginative, but also have a kind of Disney-like quality. They're somehow less serious than Tolkien would perhaps have preferred. Nonetheless, they played a huge role in influencing the public imagination, not only of Tolkien, but of the fantasy genre in general. By the way, they're also well known for this Star Wars poster created for the UK release of the film in 1977. Now, the Hildebrandt interpretation of Tolkien is important to mention because it is precisely this type of fantasy aesthetic that Peter Jackson did not want for the films. The whole point was that he wanted Middle Earth to feel like a real place with events that actually occurred in history. So however charming their work might be, the Hildebrandt version of Middle Earth is only influential to the films by way of counterexample. Now, there are, of course, many more artists who have interpreted Tolkien in their own unique and interesting ways. Some are more child-friendly, some have interesting local inflections, and just about everywhere you look, you'll find images that appear as though they might have inspired Jackson and the other artists working at a workshop. It's really impossible to know exactly which images did or did not play at least some part in the creative process, even if only subconsciously. In any case, when Peter Jackson began pre-production in 1997, he made one of the most consequential creative decisions in that project. He decided to hire Tolkien illustrators to work as lead concept artists for the films. And there were actually 3 on the list, one of whom was Ted Naismith. Now, Ted unfortunately had to decline for personal reasons, so he was never directly involved in production. But looking at his work, it's pretty clear that some of his images were known to Jackson and made their way into the film. There's even a couple specific compositions that I don't think are coincidental. Now, the other 2 artists are John Howe and Alan Lee, whom you will recognize if you ever watched the DVD extras. And it's really interesting just how involved they were in the films. They weren't just concept artists, they were often on set and were deeply integrated into every aspect of the film's production design. And that wasn't an arbitrary decision. When you really think about the scope of the challenge of designing Middle Earth for the big screen, you realize pretty quickly that a normal production design process would just not have been up to the task. It's not very often in a film that you have to depict multiple distinct and overlapping fictional cultures. How do you even begin to imagine the culture of the elves, who, because they're immortal, have had long enough to perfect everything that they do? What would their architecture look like? What would their weapons and armor look like? And it's not just fun to imagine these things, it's also profoundly difficult, and to do it in a way that is even remotely accurate to Tolkien's many long and detailed descriptions. Well, this just isn't a job for any normal art department. A great example of this is the Tower of Cirith Ungol, which appears in The Return of the King. On its surface, it might seem pretty straightforward. It's an evil fortress in Mordor, occupied by orcs, so it should be black and ominous. Maybe it should remind you of Sauron's own tower of Barad-dûr. But the thing is, Cirith Ungol was not built by Sauron. It was built by the Gondorians as an outpost after the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age, so many thousands of years ago. And not only that, the Gondorian architecture is based on Númenórean architecture, which is even more ancient. And what this means is that when John Howe is tasked with designing the tower, he's thinking about the full history of Middle-earth, the layers upon layers of civilization that give the tower its character. Now, you might be saying that you didn't really get that when you watched the film, but you did. Maybe not consciously, like you didn't have the thought, wow, that lamp is made of old Gondorian helmets, which it is, by the way. But if you ever wondered how these films achieved that sense of realism that they did, Alan Lee and John Howe's artistic process is the answer. The realism of the world is felt, even if it's not noticed. And of course, Cirith Ungol is just one example. Pretty much everything in Jackson's films required this level of thought. The fact that they couldn't just pop over to the props department and grab some swords meant that they had to make them. And that meant that they had to think about their design much more deliberately. One interesting thing about these two artists is that they actually have pretty distinctive styles. Alan Lee's work is moodier and more atmospheric. He uses watercolor with a muted palette. John Howe's work is often more bold and dramatic. So their styles really do complement one another and form a synthesis that really feels appropriate to Tolkien's world. Now, I actually think of the films less as Jackson's interpretation of Tolkien and more like Jackson's interpretation of Howe and Lee's interpretation of Tolkien, because it's really their images that are informing Jackson's entire framework for the story. And my favorite example of this is the crumbling staircase during the escape from Moria, definitely one of the high points of the trilogy. Unbelievably, this scene is not in the script. The text reads, "The Fellowship runs downstairs towards the bridge," and no action sequence was originally planned there. But when Alan Lee illustrated a staircase, Peter Jackson loved it so much he created this scene. And to this day, there's nothing in the script at that point. I just think it's so cool that this awesome scene was nobody's single vision. It was a true collaboration in which love and respect for the source material brought artists together in collective imagination. And what a result. A similar example from John Howe is Gandalf's return to Hobbiton, which we see at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring. Now, clearly, Peter Jackson wanted Bag End to look exactly like these illustrations. The circular green door with a window on each side, the little staircase leading to the door, a small fence of woven sticks, and a wooden gate with a little gable on one side. This is why it's not right to think of Lee and Howe merely as concept artists. Their designs were often followed to the letter, and I suspect that Peter Jackson had a specific reason for this. Hobbiton, and specifically Bag End, and even more specifically Gandalf arriving at Bag End, would have been one of the most familiar scenes for readers, in part because it's also how The Hobbit begins. It's kind of the quintessential Tolkien scene. Now, clearly, Jackson invested extra work in having Bag End surpass audience expectations, and he must have been conscious of the fact that Howe's illustrations of Bag End and Gandalf, which were already firmly seated in the public imagination, would have deeply informed that expectation. I'm sure you remember watching the films for the first time and thinking, wow, that's Gandalf, and there's Bilbo, and that's Bag End, just like I always imagined it. Or maybe as John Howe imagined it. By the way, the composition of these images is designed to be split into front and back book covers, but Howe has also noted that the long road into the horizon here is actually slightly ominous, as if some distant evil is stirring. So sick. Of course, anytime we're talking about an image, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about its content, but also about its framing and composition. And of course, those play a huge part in the meaning of the image too. My favorite example of this is when the hobbits hide from the Black Rider, which is composed exactly like this John Howe illustration. But even that illustration is based on Ralph Bakshi's 1978 film, which I haven't mentioned in this video yet, only because the style of illustration in that film was less informative overall to Jackson's vision. But if we're talking about framing, Bakshi certainly deserves credit here, and it's another great example of how the imagination of Middle Earth is really an intergenerational, multimedia collaboration whose influences are deeply intertwined. If you think about it from this perspective, what Jackson really did was canonize a particular image of Middle Earth rather than create it whole cloth. And even then, it's really just one interpretation of Middle Earth. And circling back to Tolkien's own visualizations of his world, I think it's fair to assume that Tolkien would not have regarded Jackson's trilogy as being precisely the world that he imagined, though I personally believe he would have appreciated the respect for his work that the films represent. Certainly, he would have appreciated the challenge of adapting The Lord of the Rings for the big screen. And I think he would have agreed that the best way to do that would be to rely on the expertise and imagination of the people who knew his world best. And that's why I believe the decision to involve Alan Lee and John Howe in the entire process might be the best and most important creative decision Jackson made in the making of these films. The lesson might be that the best creative minds know when to step back and let the collaborative process find its natural course. So thank you for watching. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to support this channel, and I'll see you on the next one.